Morning or afternoon or middle of the night. It's all good, man. Just learn what I'm about to teach you about stretching. So today's impromptu little lecture is about stretching and what's happening, concepts, and the most important thing is to be able to see through human motion or position what is being stretched, or you can play around with those things and answer how do we stretch certain groups of muscles, and then eventually you'll know how to stretch certain specific muscles. So the first thing I'm going to discuss is stretching. In some of your classes might have been talked about as taboo, like bad, like you shouldn't stretch before you lift or do activity. And there are studies that show that, and it should make sense if you stretch out a muscle that you thus need to use, you lose some of that. In physics we call stored elastic potential energy. You lose some of that rubber band effect that you would normally get in an explosive type of plyometric sequence. So I am not talking about stretching if you're trying to do some type of performance thing. I'm talking about understanding that most of you guys working with children and adults are going to be physically active at a novice level. They aren't going to be professionals. They aren't going to be in competition. Some of you may work with athletes that are in competition. That's great. You need to know the side effects of stretching immediately before you perform. But guys, a lot of you are going to be working with old people, and old people need to work on their flexibility. Movement is life. How many old people you see, bless their hearts, can barely move? And it's a snowball effect. The less you move, the more you're going to be able to not move. Move it or lose it, right? So stretching to restore as much normal range of motion is of importance. Okay? Function and being able to restore function is of importance. So, in other words, I'll give you a quick story. There was a major league ball player back in the 60s who broke his toe. And within a few months, his shoulder was done, and they attributed it down the road because since his toe was broken, he could no longer push off on the same side or the same place. So he tried to, pitch through it and changed his mechanics, changed his motion strategy, and thus stressed his arm in angles and ways he wasn't used to stretching, and arm went kablooey. The point is that function and motion is extremely important, and especially in kids, guys. We used to think of just older people. Older people were kyphotic and they're in this protracted state, and they take short little steps because they don't have regular range of motion. But guys, kids, man, we are seeing a much higher incidence of abnormal ranges of motion in kids, and that's because kids are not as active as they used to be. They are in a hunched position, a fetal position a lot of times. If you think about how much time they spend watching TV, playing games, that kind of stuff. And so I'm going to demonstrate to you how, and then I'll keep it simple, because my thing is I'd rather you get some applicability with this. But let's do a thought experiment. Imagine nothing's wrong, but we're just doing a little thought experiment. You put your arm in a sling. You get a sling and you wrap your arm in a sling, and you're going to do an experiment to keep yourself in this sling for a week. I could have said a couple days, but to really go out there to show you what I'm talking about, a whole week in the sling, okay, one arm. After a week, you're going to look like one of those little fiddler crabs with the big arm on this side and the little arm on that side. But the point is that you know this. If 1 week passes of you not using this arm at all, and not only that, but putting it in a fetal-like position where your elbow flexors have been put on slack, shortened. I'm going to explain that a little bit. But you know that when you finally get that sling off, your muscles are going to be extremely stiff, specifically your elbow flexors. Oh, it's going to be stiff. They would have tightened up. And one of the reasons they do that is because your muscles like to be at what we call resting length. They have a optimal length based on your activities of daily living that they feel the most comfortable with, that they like to be in just in case you need to recruit them. And so if resting length or the length of a muscle that it's in a majority of your life, activities of daily living, is this long, and you shorten it over time, your body will literally eat up all of that slack to reestablish a new resting length. And then finally, once it has a new resting length that it's comfortable with, and you go to stretch it, it's going to be super tight. It's going to take time to get it back to this new resting length. Think about when, and that was a week, right? I mean, just extreme. You're not going to do that for a week, but that's actually why we don't like to sling. We don't like to splint. Are there times where we got to? Absolutely. But in the past, we used to put people in slings. We used to immobilize. Guys, immobilization is not good when not necessary because you lose muscle atrophy. I mean, you gain muscle atrophy. Muscles are going to shrink because they haven't been innervated, and you're going to lose motion. You lose motion when you isolate, when you lose mobility, when you immobilize. Another thought experiment. Although not 7 days, maybe 7 hours. Imagine you go to sleep and you wake up in a fetal position, or maybe your hips are flexed, or maybe your neck has been flexed. Who knows, man? In your sleep, you could have been doing all kinds of crazy things. When you get out of bed, and it's worse for older people like me, when I get out of bed, I'm like, oh, man, my joints are really, really stiff. Reason being, I had several joints that were in overnight slings, not literally, but just shortened positions that my body started to eat up some of that slack. And then when I get up, it's a new stretched position that it's not used to be in. Okay? Then you work out some of that stretching, and then you loosen it up, and then you're good to go. So stretching is of extreme importance for all of you that are going to be therapists. I remember me personally, a personal story. I was working with a therapist on my voice. I was having some voice issues, and I went to a speech therapist, and I went to all kinds of different therapists. And then finally, I went to a good friend of mine who was a chiropractor, and we talked about how my neck muscles were just super tight from stress and overworking my vocal cords. And the speech therapist tried to get me to do some relaxation techniques, which is great. But my chiropractor friend, he's a biomechanist that applies biomechanics to the human body and muscles and like, we need to start stretching you and getting in there and loosening up those muscles. Because if you think about it, those tight muscles are kind of pulling on everything in here, and that pulls on your vocal cords. Vocal cords are like, like your tympanic membrane, like your eardrum, right? And the more you stretch it, right, the more you stretch it, the tighter it is. So we got to loosen up some of those muscles to let it flap without extra tension in there. I was getting chronic laryngitis. So one of the things he did, he'd take his thumb and he'd rub it, grind it just to loosen up that muscle. And we did a lot of stretching techniques where he would put me in positions to stretch certain muscles and loosen that stuff up. And look, some of it, again, I was putting my head in a sling, without even realizing it. Laying down on my bed watching TV. I'm in a flexed position. My eyes may be level, but repositioning my body, right? I'm like this watching TV. That's a shortened position. My muscles are going to eat themselves up in series that's in length and take up that slack. And when I get out, my muscles are so tight, right? So maybe I kind of lean back a little bit to get my eyes level, and I don't really work on stretching those cervical flexors. So our activities of daily living, or I guess another way you could put it, our activities of non-living, things that average Americans do to pass time or at work. You know, you could be at a desk for hours and hours and hours and hours, and there's a lot of things that are in sling. Your scapula could be in a sling. Your elbows could be at a sling. Your wrists could be at a sling. Your trunk, you could be hunched over and flexed, typing like Quasimodo. No wonder things tend to be tight. And then you drive. What if you commute and you drive in hours at a time and your knees are flexed and your hips are flexed and all these muscles are in fetal positions for extended periods of time. So stretching is not bad. Stretching is bad if you're about to do some type of explosive event. Think about how rare that is in the grand scheme of life. Okay, so stretching is of importance. So if stretching is going to be important for a majority of you guys out there's careers, then we need to talk about what's being stretched. How do you stretch? How do you know something's stretched? How do you put the body in positions to stretch? And so if you recall in the muscle lecture, you have Hill's muscle model, which looks at the different things within a muscle that creates pull force. The contractile components, the stuff you zap, and the stretchy components, the series and parallel elastic components. And that's the stuff that doesn't respond to being zapped. In other words, this is a TheraBand, it's made out of rubber. I could zap it with 1 billion volts of electricity. It ain't gonna do anything. It's not gonna want to shorten more. It'll just be like any cat. It'll just be like, whatever. The only thing that rubber bands or stretchy things like this TheraBand does respond to is length change. You lengthen it and it wants to pull more. You shorten it and it wants to pull less. And if you super duper slack it, it doesn't want to pull at all. So think about taking a rubber band and you just toss it on the table. When it's on slack, when it's loose, tension, but when you start to lengthen it above its rest, it starts to want to pull back. And the more you pull it, the more it wants to pull back. And if you pull it too much, sometimes happens in our body. You stretch it too much and pow. So again, to give you this analogy, if this is your resting length of a muscle and you spend an extended period of time of shortening it, putting it more on slack, your body is going to eat up that slack until it has what it wants as resting tone, pull force. And then when you go to stretch it out of that, it's like, whoa, man, that's really tight. We don't like that. Shorten back up. So it takes time to let slack back where this is now your new resting length. Okay? It takes time. That's why stretching is painful. It's tough. You got to do it every day. You got to do it over time. It's boring, but it's important. Okay? So you have some support materials in your Moodle that just takes out the area of stretching. I have an article about stretching, ACSM recommendations for stretching. From my understanding of the new research, guys, anything that involves moving your joints is good. You know, well, what's the best type of stretch? Whatever they're willing to do or whatever you can make them do. Whether that's static, which is like a move and hold, they'll do it. Dynamic, okay? The muscles kind of take it through a range of motion. Awesome. In other words, something is better than nothing. And I don't think they've seen a big difference in static, dynamic. So if it really doesn't, if what matters mostly is moving, then tailor whatever they're more comfortable with or mix it up. But we got to get people moving to establish positions that their body is the most comfortable with and that they're designed to be in. Okay, so stretching is pretty simple. If a muscle pulls, I don't know why I went real high with that, pulls, let's say I have this muscle we're going to learn in biomechanics. This is called a sternocleidomastoid muscle. It goes from the sternum and my clavicular origin to my mastoid process. So watch how if I pinned the origin and insertion of this muscle, I get a certain length. Now, this muscle, as I'm going to show you in biomechanics, is a cervical flexor. It's one of our cervical flexors, meaning that it crosses in the front and it pulls in a direction of flexion of the cervical vertebra. So now this is the length that it is at rest, position I'm in most of the time. If I extend my cervical vertebra, I lengthen it and stretch it, and I take it to a longer length. I lengthen it. That's the point of stretching, is to lengthen things. You know, when you get when you were younger and you got a new toy, whether it's a Barbie, a G.I. Joe, or something, when you first take it out of that container, those joints are snug and tight, and you got to play with it a while. And when you move it, guys, anything that has motion has an element of heat transfer to it. That's why, like when you're playing with silly putty and stuff, it starts out cold and stiff, and then as you work it through, it gets warmer and more pliable and loose, and you can stretch it out and it sinks. Movement inherently is associated with heat, warmth, more plasticity, and more movement. So when you stretch these muscles or move around, it makes them more pliable. It's another reason why you stiff at night. Your body temperature cools off. You don't have near as much motion, right? They get stiff and tight. So if the sternocleidomastoid is a cervical flexor, meaning that it pulls in the direction of flexion, and I lengthen it by extending the cervical vertebra or putting the cervical vertebra in an extended position, should make sense. Cervical flexors will be lengthened by extending neck. Shoulder flexors, muscles that pull in the direction of shoulder flexion, will be lengthened when I extend the shoulder. They're going to be stretched when I position the joint in the opposite direction of the muscle's pull. If I have horizontal adductors, I'm not going to stretch it when I have motion in the same direction of pull. I'm going to lengthen of which pulls this way by movement in the other direction. That's what's going to lengthen the muscles that pull here. Horizontal abduction lengthens horizontal adductors. Simple concept. And it applies everywhere in the body. How do I stretch wrist flexors? By extending the wrist. How do I stretch wrist extensors? By flexing the wrist. You want to know a really cool trick? Your finger extensors are also wrist extensors because these muscles get to the fingers by crossing the wrist in the back. When you have a neutral wrist, and you can grip really strong, but what happens is that if you think about it, when you flex your fingers, the finger extensors are getting stretched at the metacarpals, the proximal phalanxes, and the distal phalanxes. They're being stretched here. And you know when muscles get stretched, they can get in the way of motion. My hamstrings. When I flex my hip, my hamstrings are so tight, they're like, bro, you ain't going that far. Because when you get stretched, you get tight, you stop motion. They get too tight. So watch this, how cool. The finger extensors, the strings that pull my fingers this way, that cross my wrist in the back, they're not tight enough to prevent me from gripping something. Even though they're being stretched here, they're being stretched here, they're being stretched here, they're not tight enough to prevent my finger flexors from doing a job of gripping. But take an ink pen and do the same squeeze experiment, but flex your wrist. In other words, now we're not just stretching these strings here, here, and there. Now we're going to stretch them there. All of a sudden, you can't squeeze the pen. That's called passive insufficiency. Being stretched so much that the muscles that are trying to work this way can't overcome the stretch that's pulling back the other way. That's super cool. Okay? So what are you going to need to know for this test? You go into your materials and you look at what I posted in there. I give examples. How do you stretch the wrist flexors? By extending or being in extended position. How do you stretch the left lateral cervical benders? By bending your head to the right. If you go right ear, right shoulder, you're going to lengthen the strings or the ropes that are pulling left ear, left shoulder. It's that simple. You could apply that to anywhere in the body. How do you stretch plantar flexors? By dorsiflexing. How do you stretch inverters? By everting. Super duper simple. Cool. Alrighty, I hope you guys have a good day. This is actually the end of material for the class. I didn't want to give you guys too much right before the test. So Wednesday is super duper review day and Thursday is your final. You can do it. We'll talk to you later.